I guess Pete and I first met over the 13 colonies stuff. As Pete's been roaming the countryside, literally. He's had a very unique experience of not only traveling to a lot of the national park sites in Philadelphia, from operating out of a wagon on Independence Mall to operating off the back steps of the Poe House, I believe it was, Pete, and has traveled the East Coast, going to various parks and various locations, both portable, on foot, in his roving vehicle that he has set up. And he's been a great participant, and always enjoy learning a little bit more from Pete. So with that, Pete, I guess we can turn it over to you, and you can tell us about your experiences.
All right. Yeah, thank you. And hopefully everybody sees my slides now. I don't do this often enough to have a lot of confidence, but you also see the first
Pete,
slide.
Mute yourself if you're not Pete.
Thank you. I know we tried to make this work a couple times. The Pack Rats VHF Club meets the same day of the month, and I'm glad I'm finally here. And I know Holmesburg is really active club and influential, and it's I do like to say when I give presentations to clubs in the area that we're lucky in the Philadelphia area, I think, in that there are so many active clubs. Not all areas of the country are as lucky as we are in the Philadelphia area to have clubs like Holmesburg and Pack Rats. And in my case, I'm also in the Pottstown Club. So we're fortunate here. A little bit about myself before we get into the meat of it. I studied ham radio as a teenager, but with no money and then with no time, career, and kids. It's a kind of a common story. I didn't get licensed until I had the technician license at a cram course at the Trenton Computer Fair, and got the general ticket a year later. And I had always been interested in roving, so I knew that was an activity that I wanted to try when I first got into ham radio. So far, I've used 4 different vehicles for roving, and I'll be describing those in the rest of the presentation. And for what it's worth, so far I've published seven ham radio articles in 3 different magazines. So one of which I'll talk about on the very last slide. I do have a request of your club at the very end. Now, I'm talking about portable operations, and I'm talking about mostly my own portable operations. I'm not trying to say here's how to do portable operations, but I've done it in a few different ways. So I thought it would be interesting to see different ways of doing it, at least from my personal experience. And this material is just scratching the surface, and you can go to my QRZ page if you're interested in more details on any of the particular topics I'll be talking about tonight. So links here, but of course you can just go to QRZ and look up my call sign. So in that theme of talking about my own experiences, I'm not tonight talking about wire antennas. I often give talks about parks on the air and how best to do those, and most park on the air activations are performed with wire antennas or bottom loaded vertical antennas, and it's the cheapest, simplest way of getting started in that kind of activation. I've listed a few here, but that's not what I'm going to talk about tonight. My priority for my own operations is vehicle mounted and quick operations. But if you're interested in parks on the air and similar operations in the field, there's a lot of material via the Parks on the Air website, Facebook groups, YouTube. There's a whole lot of information if you want more details about operating in that way. A few definitions. In my own mind, people disagree with some of these, but the definitions I use is that a portable station implies that there's some setup required, as opposed to a mobile station that can operate in motion at all times. So what's a mobile station that operates only standstill? It's a rhetorical question, and one of those answers is a rover station. So in my opinion, a rover station, one of the definitions of a rover station is that it's self-contained, including power. It usually operates standing still, but not always. Usually it does. It's primarily concerned with a quick setup, and it doesn't require external antenna support like trees or stakes in the ground or anything like that. All self-contained, you drive, you set up and operate. And maybe one quick definition of a rover, because I'll be using that word a lot tonight, is a self-contained vehicle portable station. there's lots of reasons people choose to rove. It's a somewhat of an unusual activity, and some of the reasons for me include driving around on unfamiliar roads and planning the route, meeting the schedule that you're trying to obtain, whether you're trying to activate a lot of parks or participating in a mobile contest. The challenge of building a mobile radio station is substantial because you don't have much space and you don't have much power. So it's kind of fun to try to adjust what you want in your mobile station compared to what you can do. It's fun to be the rare DX in that you can attract pileups. And for most of us with modest home stations, we're never going to get a pileup. And this is a way of having that experience. And some people are intimidated by it, but a lot of us enjoy that feeling of being popular out there when we start operating. I get looks on the road of having big antennas on a vehicle, so that's kind of funny that I get pictures taken of the vehicle driving down the road, and people talk about it. You should see this weird guy on the road with the big antennas that I saw today on Route 422, for instance. Competition and contest I like anyway. And this is a way of doing it where there's a little bit less competition than there would be being a fixed station. You also can be a relatively big station in the world of mobile operating in a small package at a much lower cost than if you wanted to be a big competitive station and a fixed station, because everybody, no matter how much money or time you have, you're severely restricted in what you can build, so you can be a big fish in a small pond. It avoids restrictions for what you can or can't do in your home. And as we all know, that's getting increasingly difficult for a lot of hams that live in areas with severe restrictions. And lastly, once you've outfit a vehicle for doing one outdoor activation, you're ready to do other ones like field day and parks on the air and state QSO party. So if you have one interest of mobile operating, now you're all ready to go if you decide to do something else outdoors. Now, my first section of my presentation is my earliest experience in VHF and HF roving using the family minivan. And in this case, I use the family minivan. We had a family of 5. They're mostly gone now, but family of 5. And the difficult part of this style is having to put all the stuff inside the van and then take it out at the end. I just mentioned VHF contests this weekend, and not everybody knows the basics of VHF contests. So one thing that I'm sure everybody listening tonight doesn't have this problem, but a lot of hams, when they hear VHF or UHF, they immediately and only think of FM and mostly on repeaters. But in weak signal VHF, we contest in VHF, it's a sideband, CW, and WSJT modes, and WSJT includes the most famous mode, FT8, as well as several others. Usually not FM, it's not restricted, but most people don't make contacts on FM in a contest, and definitely can't use repeaters like you'd expect for most contests. Like every ham contest, there's a multiplier involved. So you have the number of contacts and you multiply by something, no matter what the ham contest in. They almost all have multipliers. In the case of VHF contests, it's the number of grids contacted. And if you're not familiar, a grid referred to a maidenhead grid system where there are 2 letters, 2 numbers, and sometimes following 2 letters and 2 numbers, etc. In our area, and I don't know how well this is going to show up where my pointer is pointed now, we're in the area of FN20, which is southeast Pennsylvania and central New Jersey. And nearby grids include FN30 for New York City and Long Island, South Jersey, and northern Delaware is in FM29. And so this is the multiplier that you'd give out. The important part for roving is that when I go to a new grid square, so my home grid is FN20 and I go to Gap, Pennsylvania and operate in FN10, I'm in effect a new station. So everyone who previously contacted me can contact me again. My first effort at VHF roving was a near disaster. I had these loops up on the roof. One of them fell over while I was driving. I made exactly 1 contact with the superstation with the Pack Rat Club up in K0BAK, And I came home pretty dejected, thinking that, well, maybe I can't do this. But luckily, I persevered despite my natural pessimism. And by September, I had a more substantial station I drove around in. And this is a walk-up mast. So this is a tilt, and you connect the mast sections and walk that mast up from horizontal to vertical. And I have 3 Yagis at the top with a consumer rotator at the top. And believe it or not, without the rope supports, at least, I drove about 100 yards down this country farm road to cross over from one grid to another. And I don't think it was very smart, but I did it and probably won't do it again. In January, I decided, hey, it took too long to build that mast system up, so I kept the antennas up on a genuine ham rotator, topping out at about 12 feet. I put the equipment on this wire rack to make it easier to move in and out, and I added a transverter so I could be on 4 bands instead of 3. So the 222 band, which is not available in radios because it's not a band in Japan, believe it or not. And the other 3 bands I used through the IC 7100 radio that has a 6, 2, and 432 bands available. Also had this system in June of 2015. A little bit easier to see the picture here in the daylight. Up here, I have the 432 and 222 antennas on this fiberglass horizontal mast, so the metal won't interfere. And at the top here is a 6-meter Moxon, and they're pretty popular for rovers because a full-size 6-meter antenna is too wide to drive around in, and the Moxon is kind of just the right width. It doesn't give you much gain, but it gives you, for its size, it gives you a lot of front to back. So it's nice to be able to reject noise or stations that are too strong that you're trying to avoid. In June, I got rid of the 7100 and replaced it with higher performing transverters. You can see 2 transverters added here. The radio was replaced with the QRP SDR radio from Flex Radio, the Flex Radio 1500. You can see amplifiers down here for the all 4 bands. This is a manual switch for switching the IF from the radio to the 3 transverters. And here's my rotator control. And again, that's all mounted on a wire rack. And by now, I couldn't move this thing on my own, so I needed help from my son to get it in and out of the band. Again, having to do it every contest, putting it in, setting it up, and tearing it all down so it can be used as a normal minivan when I'm not using it for a contest. Here's one of my favorite pictures in July. There's a only 2-band 6-meter and 2-meter contest run by the CQ magazine, and this picture appeared in their magazine overlooking the Hudson River in Bear Mountain, New York. So Bear Mountain's a nice place to go because you have this location. It's in FN 31 and another grid at the very top of the mountain that you can drive to in FN 21. In January of 2016 is the big contest for pack rats where we try to win the club contest every January, and that contest is significant in that the microwave bands count for more points for each microwave band than the other contests during the year. And we try to zoom in here on this little box of the pack rats. This has got to be 20, maybe 30 years old. This little box was built by a genius pack rat in the past, and it contains 6 microwave bands from 902 megahertz all the way up to 10 gig. And you see these tiny antennas. So the idea is I drive to, and I'm probably going to do that this weekend. The idea is that I will drive to pack rat driveways and make short distance contacts on QRP, and then the rest of my station there is in the background, so I can make contacts on 10 different bands using this configuration, but only short distance. My personal record is making 10-kilometer contact with the superstation, and so I know I'm legit because you have to be capable of making at least a 1-kilometer contact to be legal in ARL VHF contests. So we talked about VHF roving, and now I'm going to get into HF roving. My I first aimed at state QSO parties, in particular the Pennsylvania QSO party that happens, I believe it's the second weekend in October. And in this case, you operate from different counties and you become a new station. Just like in VHF, you go to different grids and become a new station. I also, using that same station, participated in National Parks on the Air. That was an ARL thing in 2016. And then an ongoing program, independent program called Parks on the Air that you probably heard of, that I mentioned earlier in the presentation. I already had a good station for operating in those programs, so I was able to go out and participate in those. Also the stations are good for a field day, special events like 13 Colonies. When I get an opportunity to operate as WM3PEN, I like to operate from parks when I can. So this lets me like operate from Valley Forge, so a famous site that's related to the concept of 13 Colonies. I've also operated national HF contests from Delaware, so I can be a popular station. Delaware is a relatively rare state and ARL section. And one activity that's a lot of fun is combining Parks on the Air and contests. So Parks on the Air is kind of unusual in that it has no required exchange. And the flip side of that is that if it doesn't have any required exchange, any exchange is okay. So many POTA participants will operate, say, a state QSO party from parks, so you get to participate in both things at the same time, and I find that a lot of fun. My original HF antenna was this 27-foot elevated ground plane vertical. It took a little bit of time to build, but it wasn't too bad. I would say 10 or 15 minutes to build this and then break it down and put it in the back of the minivan. And as many of you who are on HF know, an elevated radials are much more effective than ground radials. So even though this has 6 spiky radials up in the air, it's has a decent performance because of that elevation. Now, this is not a resonant antenna on any particular band, so I also have an automatic transmatch that keeps the radio happy when I'm using this non-resonant antenna. And that antenna took a bit of time to set up, so it wasn't too long before I decided to go get a screwdriver antenna. And as I'm sure most of you know, screwdriver antenna is a bottom loaded coil with a motor, so you can adjust the coil from inside the car. And to increase efficiency, I have a so-called small capacity hat. That's, I guess, impossible to see in this picture, but it's a little spiky contracting that goes just above the coil that helps increase efficiency, lowers the number of coil turns you have to use. And then I use a 17-foot telescoping whip from MFG. This is not 17 foot at the time, but because it's telescoping, I can adjust the length. So on 30 meters and below, I use the full length and use coil turns in the screwdriver antenna. And on 20 meters and above, I have to adjust the length of this antenna. But the good news is now I have a resonant vertical antenna on 20 meters and above, with the proviso that I have to adjust the antenna. And getting on the air, because this part is already attached to the car, getting on the air is literally less than a minute. All I have to do is use a quick disconnect attachment on the on this longer whip, and I'm on the air pretty quickly with a decently efficient antenna. I have a few action pictures here, if you will. This is the elevated ground plane in a dramatic background with these storm clouds coming in on Mount Penn, operating on a field day. Here I am with the screwdriver antenna operating from the highest point you can drive to in Manhattan. And that doesn't look like much like Manhattan, but I participate in the New York QSO party operating from the 5 boroughs of New York City. And I start out in Manhattan at this location, and it's a good start to that contest. Here's the elevated ground plane at my first activation in National Parks on the Air in 2016 on a cold winter morning, and it's a kind of a pretty picture with the sun not quite up yet. And the idea here is I was trying to get the European stations before the clatter on the East Coast starts up. Didn't really go according to plan, but I did make contacts, and that was the start of many other activations in parks from this point. Here I'm pointing out the ability to go to a location, set up quickly, and get out. So I'm here at Gettysburg Military Park, and I can pull over to the side of the road, make a few contacts, and break down and move off before anybody objects to me being there, which is one of the themes of these quick breakdown and setup concepts. And here, talking about WM3PEN, my first participation there was when we were solicited to do VHF operations for WM3PEN. Here I'm in Mount Penn near Reading with this same walk-up mast I showed earlier, except extended even farther because there's only one antenna at the top there. So I don't operate this way anymore, but it's because my back hurts too much to do that. But it was a nice way of getting antenna up in the air at relatively low cost. Yeah, to talk about radios for a little bit, I originally used the ICOM IC7100 radio, and this is a terrific starter radio. It's a great value, and it includes HF 6 meters, 2 meters, and 70 centimeters on sideband, CW, and WSJT. So this is great to get started in both HF contesting and VHF contesting. Another advantage of this radio is that it has a separate control head, and having the main unit of the radio back where your power and RF is, and then have have your control head over where you're operating. I typically operate from the driver's seat of the car, makes it a convenient way to use a radio and simplifies the wiring inside a vehicle. In my first contest in the Pennsylvania QSO party in 2014, one thing that frustrated me was that I could often hear stations who couldn't hear me. I mean, they could hear me, but they couldn't make a complete copy. So I thought, well, there's one way to solving that is to put more power out. So this is the Ameritron 500 watt, so-called 500 watt. I run it at 350 to 400 watts. That runs off at 12 volts. So that's why they call it the mobile amplifier. And again, just like with the ICOM radio, one advantage of this amplifier is that the main unit can be set where it's convenient for RF and power connections, and we have a wired remote control so I can operate the amplifier from the front. So it's got manual band selection and the manual on-off switch that I can use from where I'm operating. So that's a nice solution for getting a little more power out on HF when you're operating mobile. The battery connections I used in the minivan, I had a professional audio installer put this stuff in because I didn't have a lot of confidence back then with doing wiring of any kind, especially high current wiring. So here he added a DC circuit breaker. And what's nice about this is that I can have this off when I'm not operating radio at all, and only have it on when I am operating. And a relay here, and that relay closes the circuit only when the car is on. So only when the alternator is on does this system deliver power to the back of the van, where I have a separate kind of car size battery in the back just for the radio. So these cables here are connected to the picture I just showed you in the front, and that charges the battery while I'm driving between locations to operate, and it is not charging when the engine is off. So it's a nice system, and it's all inside a trolling motor battery box. So closed up, it looks like this, and it gives a little more protection to this battery, as well as having a built-in 60 amp circuit breaker. So it was a nice solution for my requirements here. Now, a vital part of this system was a voltage booster. Unfortunately, these are not available anymore. The ham who used to build and sell these is a silent key now, but this is an 80 amp voltage booster, so that as this lead acid battery drops, and I'm sure most of you know, as you take power or take energy out of a lead acid battery, the voltage goes down more or less linearly, and it pretty quickly reaches a point where modern radios will not operate properly, and ICOMs are probably worse about that than the average radio. So what this little box does is, as this battery starts at say 13.5 volts and is discharged to around 10.5 volts, this booster will keep the voltage up at 14 volts for my radios and amplifier. And I showed a wire rack before for VHF operating, and here's the version for HF. Obviously, it's a lot simpler for HF because you don't have to have a separate amplifier and a separate transverter for VHF. That makes things so complicated and expensive on VHF. So it's kind of nice to have just a few components for HF. Here's the amplifier I talked about before, the main unit of the IC7100. Below that, a little bit bigger box here is the automatic transmatch I have to use with the with that elevated ground plane that I first showed. And up here is an automatic tuner for the screwdriver antenna, but I've since gotten rid of this because this doesn't give me much help, and now I manually adjust the screwdriver almost as quickly as the automatic tuner can. And one more thing to point out, grounding is vital in HF, so I have these ground straps connected around to the different HF components, and this is kind of a half-baked solution, but I have one strap down here with gripped to a little piece of metal here that's meant to hold down the seats of the minivan. These, like a lot of minivans, the seats can be removed, so I sanded off the paint and just have the strap connected with this clamp. So not the best in the world, but it seems to work. I don't have a lot of RF inside the vehicle problems. Now, currently, I bought a Subaru Forester a couple of years ago when every vehicle was very expensive. But I had to get a new vehicle and replace my small sedan with the Subaru Forester, and I'm just starting to use it. I used it in the Pennsylvania, the last Pennsylvania QSO party and the New York party. A lot of the newer park locations in Pennsylvania are Pennsylvania game lands, and most of them are at best gravel, and many are just dirt, meaning mud parking lots, and some are at the end of unimproved roads, gravel or dirt roads. So the Forester with all-wheel drive is better to get to those locations anyway, and plus it is my vehicle, so it's my only choice anyway. I recently got the new ICOM IC705 QRP radio that has the same band capabilities and mode capabilities that my 7100 does, but it's QRP. So I have a amplifier, 200-watt amplifier to boost that up, and I now use a 90-amp-hour lithium battery with a smaller regulator for the radio and unregulated for the amplifier. So I adjusted this a couple times. I'm still learning, and I use the same antenna system as the old car, but my intention is to go forward with this configuration. And I got one picture here in the Pennsylvania QSO party up in rare Cameron County, up here at this wind farm area. You can see the huge blades. They make a very eerie sound, by the way, when you're this close to them running. And I bought from Tar Heel Tar Heel is the one who manufactures this screwdriver antenna, a tilt-over mount. And the intention of that is to be able to open the hatch in the Subaru. But I did an experiment and found out that, hey, I can operate this way. So many times in a state QSO party, I'll keep that leaned over to operate to get some NVIS action. And in fact, I set a personal record with the number of counties I contact within Pennsylvania. So got to say, that's only one experience, but it seemed to work pretty well. I got, I think, 65 or 64 counties out of 67. So did better than I ever did as far as in-state contacts are concerned. And pretty much impossible to see. Maybe you can barely see it. Part of this field installation is two 50-foot wires at the bottom of the screwdriver antenna to give a couple of radial sense. This vehicle was not grounded very well or at all, unlike the minivan where I did a decent amount of grounding. And here I'm just mostly relying on these two long radial wires. And again, I can tune it fine and operate fine. So I think it's working for me. I'm gonna stick with those long wires when I operate whenever I can. Now, up to now, I talked about our minivan operations, and it's kind of conventional, right? It's kind of accessible to anyone, but now we're going to get extreme with a TV production van, otherwise known as an ENG, or electronic news gathering van. So here it is in operation in one of the VHF contests. It's a big commercial van with a lot of room for installations inside, but its obvious attraction here is a 30-foot pneumatic mast. And at the top here are the same 4 antennas I showed you earlier on the minivan. So I've had this for a few years. I've made progress real slowly, but it's in regular operation now for me. When I first picked it up, this is the picture of the van at the dealer, and you can see there's a lot of equipment on the roof that I had to remove. That's kind of ironic. I have these super sophisticated dish antennas, one to contact satellites and one on top of the pneumatic mast to do live news reports back to the tower for the TV station. All pretty cool stuff, but I had no use for it for what I wanted to use the van for. And taking these heavy items off the roof was a major project, and I was grateful to get help from fellow HF club members to get that stuff off the roof. Here's the inside before I bought the van. Obviously, they removed all their electronic equipment and left behind a lot of cables. So getting rid of all these cables without cutting them was a major project in itself. And as you might imagine, the interior is pretty filthy because it's only seen electronic equipment, right? So this is the second most valuable part of this van, is the availability of these 4 racks to be able to install a lot of ham radio equipment in a compact area. Here's those same antennas I showed before here in my driveway, and an even closer look is here, and you can see the same antennas, the same fiberglass cross member for the 432 and 222 antennas, but what I want to show the most is this relay. This is a 4x1 coax relay, and this is used to multiplex the 4 bands up a single coax. Since at every stop I have to connect the coax before I bring that pneumatic mast up and down, and making just 1 instead of 4 connections is a big help. Plus 4 substantial. I'm using LMR 400 for low loss. It would be pretty heavy to have 4 cables. So I multiplex the signals using a relay here on top of the mast, and then the very same relay is also inside the van in order to select the bands inside. This is a 2x2 piece of plywood that I have sandwiched between the pneumatic mast that's part of the van down here and the Yaesu 800 rotator. And kind of a miracle, the plate that I already had for the pneumatic mast matched up with the threaded holes for the rotator. So that was a big help. So I just bought some big bolts and connect this platform. The platform helps to tie things down that aren't rotating. The output of the cables here, a little bit of equipment. And also is a convenient place, and it's a practical thing that comes up a lot. It's a nice place for me to have my tools as I'm working on the items on top of the mast here. As much as I would like to, I'm not going to go through the details of this, but here's the electrical diagram of the van that I designed, and the biggest takeaways here is that it supports both AC and DC power in a single integrated system, as well as a 2-way charging system between the vehicle batteries and the station batteries. On the AC portion, this is the AC power panel mounted on the rear of rack number 1, and here's circuit breakers for that configuration. The AC power comes from an inverter. They can just barely see that blue down here is a 3 kilowatt AC inverter, and then it gets distributed from this circuit breaker box, and here intended for high power amplifiers or are two high current AC outlets. And then natively, all 4 racks have AC available. So I'm also powering AC at a lower current, a more conventional household current of 15 amps or so to the 4 racks. And both the supply of AC and the distribution of AC goes back to the native AC power distribution that's here. So in the back of the van, this is what it looked like when I bought the van. And luckily there was a lot of open locations for this in this big terminal block. So that's where I added, you can barely see up here, those 2 cable bundles. And I was able to use these terminal strips to wire into the existing AC distribution system in the van. So now there's kind of a funny thing here that I did all this work and it was under stress because I was doing work in a cold garage because our basement was getting flood work done. After a flood, doing major work in the basement. So I was out freezing in the garage doing this work. Turns out I don't use AC in the van. It's still available if I ever wanted to, but I changed my mind and changed the radio, and it's kind of funny, all that work is done and I don't really use it. But anyway, I'm kind of proud of the work that was done. On the DC side, there's, let me try to, I guess you can see it on the full size slide. On the bottom here on this big white panel are 2 switches. I have 2 batteries. You can barely see it, but I'll have a better view in the next slide. 2 large batteries are in back, and these 2 switches can each select either battery or both together in parallel. One of these switches supplies the big inverter at up to 200 amperes per battery to do that 3 kilowatt AC in theory. I did test it with 2 space heaters, so it does work. And on this side is the DC power that goes to the radios and amplifiers, a 12-volt DC power through that same voltage booster I showed you earlier. And here are 2 voltage and current meters. It uses Hall effect transducers to get the measure of current, so it alternates between voltage and current, and then a meter in the meter down here to be able to monitor the batteries without the batteries being switched into their respective components. So this is the high current side of the switching. The lower side part of the switching is in this panel above. On the left is a switch that can switch between all my VHF versus all my HF components. I mean, obviously, typically in any particular Rove, I'm only doing VHF or HF, but not both. And over here, these toggle switches in this meter supports the 2-way charging system that I mentioned earlier, where I can, while the van is being operated, I can charge. Well, it's not completely charging, but I can extend the life of the charge of the station batteries by using the van alternator. And in another toggle position, I can use a trickle charger that's built in here in order to charge the vehicle batteries while the van is connected to so-called shore power, connected to commercial power, because a lot of times the van is just in storage. So when you had lead acid batteries, you always want to keep them under charge if they're going to be stored for more than a couple of weeks to keep the life of the batteries up. Here's that view of the 2 batteries. They're pretty big physically and electrically. These are both 200 amp hours, and in comparison, most car batteries are in the order of 80, 90 amp hours. So the size of this is about 50% larger than a typical car battery, 2 of them. And as you saw on the front panel, there's 2 connections, a 200 amp side and an 80 amp side. Each of those are connected to a ice cube size fuse that I never knew existed until I got into this. So both those fuses are connected directly to the terminal of the battery. And I do want to emphasize that when you're dealing with lead acid batteries of this size, it's really important to get that thing fused or a circuit breaker as close to the terminal as you possibly can, because as you might guess, these batteries each can deliver well over 1,000 amps and can weld any mistake you do. It can weld a tool. So it's a little bit scary to put these together, to tell you the truth. And while in operation, these fuses help make it a little safer. That 80 amp voltage booster I showed you in the minivan is now located here. It happens to fit just right between these batteries. And I wish I could take credit for carefully mechanically designing this, but It was just luck that it just fit between the batteries. So that was nice. And here's the back side of the panel that I showed earlier with the connections to the switches, and these small wires are all for voltage and current monitoring. In order to distribute the power to the station, whether it's the regulated voltage booster voltage or the raw voltage from the batteries themselves, I built this rack shelf, and it took a long time to lay out and build all these components. You see these solenoids, that's part of that two-way charging system to connect the station batteries to the vehicle batteries only when the vehicle is in motion. And here's the input from the vehicle batteries to connect all that together. VHF amplifiers are connected here. The HF amplifier is connected back here, and these, of course, run to the switches in the front that I showed 2 slides ago. In addition to mostly the 12 volts in the van, I also have a 50-volt system to run just the 6-meter amplifier. And I talked before about my experience in the Pennsylvania QSO party, where I was frustrated that people couldn't make contacts with me that I could hear clearly, but they couldn't hear me. So the same thoughts went into 6 meters. Unlike all the other bands, it seems not to be a problem, but on 6 meters in particular, I need more power output. Probably because I only have a MOX on, so it has darn near no gain. So I use this amplifier to be heard better. It is a 50-volt amplifier, so I don't have a picture of it, but I have a large lithium battery sitting in back of the rack that supplies the 50 volts for that one amplifier. And down here is a rack shelf for switching, controlling, monitoring that 50-volt supply. Here's our kind of unusual, at least in consumer uses, is a rack mount PC. The original radio I had intended to use in the van needed a significant amount of CPU power. The past generation of Flex radios did almost all their processing on the PC, so I needed a beefy PC. I later changed that radio and don't need such a beefy PC, but this is the one I have, so I continue to use it. The one thing I really want to point out here is I replaced the power supply within the PC from the conventional AC input to a DC input. So this power supply, and it wasn't cheap, but this PC power supply has, and you can barely see it behind this coax cable, has an input from the raw station battery. So the input to this can accept between 9 volts and 16 volts. So I don't even have to boost the power. I get it connected to the raw station batteries, and this is a big help to eliminate a source of needing AC power that you would normally need for a moderately powerful PC like this. I mentioned that I replaced the radio with a newer version of a Flex radio. The new version of Flex radios require very little CPU power. In contrast, I bought a Flex 6500 used from a fellow pack rat at an extremely good price, and I probably wouldn't have bought this if I couldn't get it for such a nice price from a fellow pack rat. So here's the actual radio. And I use it for HF and for 6 meters natively. It also has a special transverter port with a 1 milliwatt output. That 1 milliwatt output for the transverters gets connected to this 5-band transverter. I don't know if you remember, but early in the presentation, I showed you 3 different transverters I had. I replaced that because it's a lot simpler and smaller to use this 5-band transverter. So this transverter will handle 144 through 1296 megahertz on the ham bands on those frequencies. I only use the lower 3 bands up to 432, but someday I hope to use the 902 and 1296 bands. So using special connectors and a little bit of my own relay circuitry. What's nice is that from the interface for this SDR, I can select bands higher than the native bands in the radio, and it will select the right band and select the right band of the transverter, as well as connect the transverter output. So it appears like I have a radio that goes from 160 meters to 1296 megahertz. That's kind of neat, just by clicking a button. Everything's automated, so everything works together. The output of this 5-band transverter is between 10 and 20 watts, and that those bands are fed individually to a small rack of 3 medium power amplifiers, 200 to 400 watt amplifiers on the 3 bands from 144, 222, and 432 megahertz. These aren't completely connected yet in this picture, but you can see the power connections and the PTT connections that are switched in circuitry you can't see. And then the coax goes in these inputs and outputs to the 3 amplifiers. The 2 meter amplifier in particular, I put high volume fans on the top of the heat sink for the 2 meter amplifier, and that allows me to run. This amplifier will do 400 watts peak for sideband and CW, but for WSJT modes, it's a continuous carrier. So these fans allow me to run 2 meters on FT8 at 200 watts, and 200 watts and 7 dB antenna gives me a pretty loud signal for a mobile station. It helps me a lot in VHF contests where 6 meters and 2 meters are the money bands where most contacts are made. This picture was taken in 2019, so the equipment over here is not the same as what's there today, but mostly I want to point out this relatively large monitor. This is a 4K monitor because in modern VHF contests, you need a lot of screen real estate between looking for and sending spots. The SDR interface is up here. You have, of course, the logging, you have WSJT, you have the rotator control. So there's a lot of stuff going on the screen, and I felt a 4K monitor was a requirement for operating in VHF contests. What's nice about this is that larger Samsung monitors have a separate power brick, and the voltage coming out of the power brick is about 14 volts DC. So what's nice is I cut that connector and splice it into my regulated voltage from the station. So this monitor is running off my own DC supply rather than a supply of AC that came with the monitor. The 4th rack is for microwaves. Now, I physically installed the microwave equipment from a retired Rover and years ago, but I never got it on the air. It's still not on the air. It's a future project. Always seems to be a future project, but these are microwave bands from 902 up to 5 gigahertz and supplied by these 2 independent batteries. In this case, these batteries are connected in series for a raw nominal 24 volts out. That 24 volt out goes to a power shelf that I built, and the 24 volts goes into these Meanwell DC to DC power supplies, supplying 26.5 and 12.6 volts to amplifiers to that requirement. I mean, these are all like hacked together and surplus amplifiers, so you often find that they have different power requirements. And this relay board turns on the power to the amplifiers just when they're being operated, because a lot of the amplifiers on microwave bands are, say, Class A, where it draws a significant amount of current even when there's no RF going to it. So I just save some energy by save battery life by only having the amplifiers on when the relay is engaged. And this is kind of amusing to me. I don't know if it is to you, but I said that I got this microwave equipment from a retired Rover. He operated with 3 of the bands, starting with the 33 centimeter, no, the 13 centimeter, 23, 13, and 6 centimeters. So these are 3 bands, and he had it on one large plywood board. And after disconnecting one of the components, this amplifier disconnected, I actually took this entire board and sawed up the boards on a table saw, which is kind of insane, but it worked. And so, especially somebody like me who I just started doing stuff like that a few years ago, I wasn't much of a tool user before getting into ham radio. So that was an exciting time. I split that up and then mounted them on individual relay racks that you saw in the picture 2 slides ago. So I'm gonna pause just for a second to ask Bob or Saul. This would be a good break if you wanted to stop the presentation now, or I can continue on this part of the presentation that includes Pedestrian Portable. So it's your call if you want me to continue or not.
To go ahead.
Go ahead. Okay. So So we're going to take a big left turn here. I talked about increasingly complicated and costly vehicles for doing activations. And now I'm going to talk about pedestrian portable operations in cities. Now, a park, we're going back to activating so-called park. A park is a generic term for a site operated by a park service, like the National Park Service. Most activations, you picture a park, there are trees, there's grasses, big areas to park in, but for, say, national historic sites and national monuments that are operated by the National Park Service, and some state sites are in urban areas where it might just be a building or it might be a postage stamp park that you can't park on. And that means that most urban parks have to be walked in. In addition, parks on the air rules are strict about being on park property. So in other words, if there's, say, just a house that's a historic site, I can't just park in front of the house and be legal for parks on the air. I have to be on park property, which requires you to have a pedestrian portable station that takes up only a very small area. So I built up a couple stations for that purpose. I should also mention that it's quite a challenge to activate urban parks because you have the difficulty of getting you and the equipment transported, little room to set up. You have a high profile, and what I mean by that is you can attract unwanted attention from law enforcement or park rangers. Some sites in cities are culturally sensitive, and many are restricted, needing explicit formal permission before activating them. And then RF-wise, I'm sure it's not surprising to anyone that there's very high RF noise in cities, making it hard to hear other stations. You have to use a small antenna because you need a very small footprint for these parks, and you're close to buildings, right? So your signal's bouncing around and getting absorbed by all the stuff around you. So it's a tough situation, and I kind of enjoy overcoming all those challenges to successfully activate National Park Service sites inside cities. So the first of the two stations was termed the Nerd Wagon by one of my fellow National Parks on the Air participants. This is basically the same station that I had in the minivan. So I have the large car size battery here, the voltage booster, and the 500-watt amplifier being able to be dragged on this big wagon. So that takes up the back half of the wagon, and the front half, as you can see, is taken up by a relatively large tripod and mast system, same kind of mast system I used that I showed in earlier slides when I'm in the minivan. And here's an example of its setup. Here I am in Independence Hall, and the Independence Hall Park extends for 3 city blocks in Philadelphia. This is not the WM3 PEN operation, but it was exactly like this. And you can see there's a hamstick dipole about 20 feet up in the air. These are all sandbags. I should note that National Park Service parks are very strict about not having wires in trees or stakes in the ground. So if I want to keep this setup strong and steady, I had to bring in these sandbags that were also put on top of that wagon. And then the wagon itself is hard to see, but the radio equipment is in the wagon over here. Another place we operated from was the roof of the Franklin Institute, which was a National Parks on the Air site. And I worked with Derek Pitts. I don't know if some of you probably know Eric is Derek Pitts. I'm sorry. Derek Pitts is the chief astronomer for the Franklin Institute, and he is a ham, not very active, but he's a ham. And I worked with him and was kind of thrilling to meet a local celebrity too. I went down to talk to him before we to decide how we're going to operate and configure the system. This translucent object behind me is a retractable roof for the Franklin Institute's observatory, and this actually moved during our operation. So it was kind of funny to have this whole thing move back and forth linearly while we were operating. And I did this with a team of 3 other hams. So that was a fun day activating this for the first time for National Parks on the Air. Now that's that wagon station is used for just a few sites within Philadelphia, but most of the sites I've activated use what I call the stooper station, and that cute name refers to the fact that it can be set up on the stoop of a building if necessary because it has such a small footprint. I use a ham stick dipole just like the other station I showed, and some of the characteristics of that is that in general dipoles will pull in less noise than a vertical antenna in general. Another choice for doing this kind of small footprint operation is a magnetic loop, but magnetic loops typically only let you put like 5 to 10 watts in. And so this allows me to run a full 100 watts. And lastly, the small footprint is vital for these park operations. Use the same IC7100 radio, and the feature of having a separate control head is vital to this operation. So most of the radios inside a backpack, and then I can separately have the control for the radio wherever I need it, wherever it's most convenient for me. Part of the system is a 20 amp hour lithium battery and an automatic transmatch, which is used to extend to in effect extend the bandwidth of the hamstick dipoles. Obviously, these are tuned to a particular frequency, and the lower in frequency you go, the lower the band you go, the narrower the bandwidth is for these hamsticks. So using a transmatch allows me to use it over a wider range of frequencies than I would otherwise. And then a 10-foot tripod that you can see here. When I'm carrying it around a city, these all get carried around in 2 bags, one a pretty heavy backpack and one a longer bag. In the backpack, this is the breakdown of everything I have inside the backpack. This is a mini rack that I bought on eBay. I don't think it's available anymore, but this mini rack was available, and I have the IC7100 main unit that's in the back here. Here in the front top is that automatic transmatch, an LDG transmatch that connects with the ICOM radios and allows you to control it from a switch on the ICOM control head. And lastly, on the bottom, the heaviest component is that 20 amp hour lithium battery. And then the other components, the headset, foot switch, remote radio, and coax are all in various pockets of that backpack. And here's a breakdown of the antennas and the tripods that are in this larger bag. And the ham sticks are broken down from their the whips and the coil part of the ham sticks. Here's some bungee cords that are used to steady the tripod, like attaching it to a bench when it's a windy day. And back here is a ballon, a 1 to 2, and I said that particularly a 1 to 2, not a 2 to 1 ballon. And that's nice to try to get a balanced signal out of the dipole, as well as avoid much RF coming down the shield of the coax. So excuse me, I have to cough. So excuse me. And here's some action pictures, if you will, down at the National Mall in Washington, D.C. I'm at the World War II Lincoln and Jefferson Memorials. And I mentioned operating from stoops. Here is at the Women's Equality National Monument. It just became a part of the National Park Service in 2016. And here is Pedestrian House, which is part of the Ford's Theater site. This is the house where Lincoln died, and a now amusing but terrifying at the time activity here was when I was on 40 meters. I set off the alarms in the house, so flashing lights and horns, and it was pretty scary at the time, although I guess it's kind of funny now. So I'll always remember that operation. Up in New York City, another park that was recently added in 2016 is a Stonewall National Historic Site, and part of that site is the tiny triangular park called Christopher Park. And here I am with the hamstick dipole, but in a vertical position. I know I just talked about the advantage of a horizontal dipole for noise, but the overhang of the trees prevented me from having the hamsticks in a horizontal position. So I could rotate them around to have them be a vertical dipole in this situation. And you can see the rack here is separate because it was a hot day, and that let the air get to all these components to cool them down. And I sat on the ground here to make contacts. And a similar setup here is at Federal Hall in New York City. This is diagonally across from the New York Stock Exchange. And one of the things I mentioned when I was talking about the difficulty of urban activations is having a high profile. And there's few locations that are higher profile here than across from the Stock Exchange. Obviously, it's a high security area. And I thought I'd get hassled, but I set up, operated, and broke down, and no one said anything to me. So I felt kind of lucky in that regard. And what I found, what I think is kind of funny, is that I've been hassled a lot more in big, beautiful, conventional parks than I ever have in the city. And I have a theory about that. I think people in the city, whether they're rangers or law enforcement or citizens, see so many weird things in the city that some guy doing this goofy ham radio operation, it just doesn't get any attention because they quickly see, oh, I guess he's not a threat, having seen so many weird things in a city. And this is kind of the peak, my peak experience in national parks on the air. This is activating the Statue of Liberty. This took like 5 months of planning and negotiation and getting a official formal and expensive special use permit. And I finally got there in mid-December, and it was the last unactivated national parks site on the East Coast because it was so difficult to get ham radio, at least HF ham radio on that island. So that was a peak experience of that year. So that is the end of my presentation. Before I ask for questions, I do have an ask of all the membership of Holmesburg. If you don't mind, I have a POTA-related article that I published in the January QST. Some of you might have gotten the February one today, but this is in the January QST, and it's called My Week-Long POTA Adventure. So for ARL members, I would really appreciate if you consider voting for my article by going to this link, logging in either before or after, because you have to be a member, you have to be a logged on member. Select my article and then click submit, and that would help me out a lot. And that's a good way to thank me for the presentation if you liked it. Secondly, I mentioned this at the beginning of the presentation, but let me emphasize again, there's a lot more information on my QRZ page, including articles in web page and PDF formats, video and PDF presentations. So a lot more information if any of these topics are of more interest to you. And so, having said that, I'd like to open it up to any questions.
Steve here, W3AZT.
Yes.
What do you do about insurance on that van? I'm curious. Do you have everything fully insured?
It's just a typical vehicle insurance, and I'm kind of embarrassed to admit that I didn't take out the ARL insurance. I keep meaning to do that, and what stops me is basically laziness. You have to list out all the parts of the ham station, and as you saw in those pictures, there's a lot of components. So the station itself is not insured, but the vehicle is insured.
Right.
And it's not even that expensive. I think it's like about $240 per 6 months. So it's not
And
that bad because it's so old. As far as a vehicle is concerned, it's pretty close. It would be pretty close to being totaled if it ever got into an accident.
Right. Now, do you keep that in the garage? Is that garage kept or?
Good question. So yeah, during the warm months, I keep it on our driveway outdoors, but I also have a rental garage where it is right now for the winter months. So that's where it is right now. And there's not much. There's only the January VHF contest anyway. So it's nice to keep it nice and dry inside for about half the year. Good question.
Okay.
A couple of questions, more curious than anything else. I noticed on one of your slides, the battery, which I think I was a little confused. Lithium ion, which I think is common, or lithium iron, and the iron. And the reason I ask is I think on one of the slides you had the battery shown as LIFE something, and that Fe is usually iron. I think so. I'm kind of curious. Maybe I'm wrong about what the battery commonly is.
Yeah, the hams typically used, because it's a much safer chemistry than the lithium batteries you commonly get in consumer electronics. Most hams use lithium iron phosphate, so that's what that That's what that little
Oh, so it
chemical
actually
formula
is
for.
iron, not iron. That's interesting. I didn't
Iron,
know.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, it uses ions, ions behind the scenes, but lithium iron phosphate is a much safer chemistry than the original lithium batteries that tend to catch on fire sometimes, and it's really hard to have a lithium iron phosphate battery have a runaway condition.
Yeah, but I would guess they're heavier. Another question, you mentioned going to pack rats driveways for short-term contacts, for short-range contacts. Now, so the equipment in a VHF contest, VHF, UHF contest, microwave, as you said, needs to be capable of real communications, which I gather is now defined as 1 kilometer rather than 1 mile, which may have been years ago. But you don't have to be a kilometer away to call a legit contact. You can sit in the guy's driveway.
That's right. So the explicit rule for the ARL is that the equipment has to be capable of making a 10-kilometer contact, but you can be as close as you want as long as your equipment is capable of making a long-distance contact. And as I know, a lot of things went by quickly, but I actually verified myself that that box can make a 10-kilometer contact, where the other station is doing all the work, of course, but it is legit because I've tested it out. However, during the contest, I go to driveways and make short distance contacts.
Okay, so you can be within the circle of their station, because I think the contest says all the station. I don't remember exactly. I don't really do contesting anymore, but all the station all the station equipment and antennas have to be within, like I think it used to be 1,000 feet or something like that, and you can be within that circle. It's still a valid contact.
There's no rule that says I can't be. And I understand. I understand that's the rule for fixed stations, that all your equipment has to be within that circle. But there's nothing in the rules about some other station not being inside the same circle.
Okay, that's interesting.
And also, by the way, for those about half the places I go, also has a laser transceiver, so we make short distance laser contacts too, and that gives us another grid multiplier.
Yeah, I think the laser contacts, you have to do electronic detection, though. Is that right?
Exactly. So it's a pretty simple device on the receiver side. It goes into a what do you call it? What's it called? Anyway, the semiconductor device that when light impinges on it, it generates an electrical signal, and then that's boosted and modulates a simple tone. So you get the CW tones out from that. So yes, it is. That's a good point. It's you can't just look at a light to make a light contact. It has to be electronic demodulation, and then transmitting is a lot easier. It's basically a laser pointer whose power is connected to a Morse code key.
Oh, that's cute. One last question. I subscribe to, and I know I think there are a couple of them around now, internet remote base IRB networks. So in theory, if I wanted to spend the money, I could operate from a bunch of different grid squares in a VHF contest. Do you know whether that would be okay within the rule, or whether you physically have to be at the grid square and not just the radio for the ARRL to count it as a rover?
I didn't catch what you were describing in the first part of your question. Can you say that again?
Okay, I was saying is I subscribe. I don't know if you're familiar with them. There are a couple of remote radio type services on the internet. We rent other people's stations and use them essentially.
Yes. I use remote ham radio quite a bit,
right.
Actually.
Yeah, that's the one I'm talking about. So now, would it be legit? I don't know if you've tried it because you do real roving, but would it be legit to do roving that way, to get on a bunch of their 6 meter stations from different grid squares?
I don't know of an explicit rule about that, but I think because there are because there are a number of explicit rules about the number of operators within a rover. I think the strong implication is that if you're roving, you have to be with your station. However, in general, I know VHF as well as HF contests allow you to use remote stations, and now so I don't think you could operate a rover remotely. It's an interesting question. Now, a member of our club has done the opposite. So he has a member of our club, W3TUF, has a VHF superstation out in FN10. And what he has done, he made his truck into a rover. He goes out roving and operates his home station remotely from the rover. So he makes contact with himself while he's out in the rover while operating his station remotely. So kind of a clever thing that I don't think anybody else has done yet. As far as I know, there's nothing in the rules that keep you from doing it that way.
I've thought about doing that, but can kind of eliminate the age-old problem of going on a DXpedition and being the only DXer who doesn't work the country. You can work yourself.
Right. Yeah, you can't work yourself, but the VHF contest, unlike HF contests, VHF contests have explicit rules that allow you to enter both as separate logs, to enter a fixed station as well as a roving station. And the scenario they have in mind is somebody goes out roving and then operates, then also separately as a separate activity operates from home. So it's a little bit weird, but that's kind of what word do I want to say? I can't think of the word, but that's a way that the rules implicitly allow what he did as far as operating remotely from a rover. But they're separate logs; they're not the same log.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, I don't want to monopolize it here. Let's see who else has. Pass it back to Saul. See who else has questions. Thanks. Very interesting.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Good questions. Anyone else?